the next talk, we will see why we need, or when we need the blockchain. So, Carl Wüst, the stage is yours.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Carl Wüst. I'm a PhD student at ETH Zurich, and I will present our paper, Do You Need a Blockchain? Which is work that I did together with Arthur Scherwe last year. So I'm sure all of you noticed that in the last couple of years, there was a huge hype around blockchain technology. And a lot of those projects kind of use blockchain for blockchain's sake, and we wanted to provide some sort of methodology that can be used as guidelines to actually figure out whether it makes sense to use blockchain for some specific project. Now, before I go into the details, first a small recap on what properties blockchain actually gives us. I'm sure you all know how blockchains work. But just in principle, we have a decentralized system, we have different nodes, and we have this box in the middle which is the shared ledger. So we can look at the blockchain basically as a ledger where everyone or all of the participants can access the data that is stored there, can read it, can write to it, and everyone has the same view on it. So in Bitcoin or in any other cryptocurrency, we would record transactions. Like Alice sends 50 of whatever currency to Bob, and so on. However, we can also store any other data on there, right? So for example, we could have sensor data from some temperature sensor that records the temperature of some storage facility or some transport vehicle. And basically what this gives us is a system where we can write entries onto the ledger, but nobody's able to remove them, and we can only append these entries. So we have a shared append-only bulletin board. And this is transparent to all of the participants. So transparent in this case does not mean that everyone can necessarily see everything, because there are mechanisms with which we can provide privacy, even though we have this transparency. So an example is Zcash. In Zcash, we have transparency. Everyone can verify that the system doesn't create money out of nothing, provided that the trust assumptions hold. But nobody can see where the transactions are coming from or where they're going to. So there are mechanisms to provide privacy even though we have this transparency. And another option that we have with blockchains is that we can add some validation rules. So it's not just an arbitrary bulletin board where we can just write anything to, but we can have some rules to which the messages that we write onto this bulletin board have to conform. So in Bitcoin, this means that we have to have a signature on the transaction has the correct form, and so on. And we can have similar validation rules for any kind of data we put on there. This is part of the consensus protocol, basically. We have some limit on what we can write onto the blockchain. However, this does not mean that we have authenticity, and this is a very important part. So authenticity means that we can make sure that whatever data we have there is kind of the right data, so it's the data that we actually want. So the blockchain does not give us the possibility to verify that the data that we have there is actually the correct data. And this is in Bitcoin, for example, the authenticity is provided by the signatures that we have on the transactions. The blockchain does not play a role there. The blockchain is there to make sure that we cannot have any double spending, but it does not provide authenticity. And this means that if we add some external data to the blockchain, we don't have any guarantees on this. So this is also sometimes called garbage in, garbage out. If we write some data onto the blockchain, if we do something with that data, so if we enter some inputs to a smart contract, and the smart contract does something with that, if the data is the wrong data, then whatever we will be doing in the smart contract will also be wrong. Another thing that we need to consider if we're looking at what we get with blockchains is also the drawbacks that we get from blockchains. And this is, or one of the main parts there is the performance. So for example, if we use kind of a centralized database system, this can also be replicated. This doesn't mean it has to be like one single server, but just a system where we don't have the expensive consensus protocol running. We have a very high throughput and we have very low latency. But if we move into more open systems, the throughput sinks and the latency increases. So if we have some permission system like Hyperledger Fabric, we have kind of very few nodes that take part in the consensus protocol, which means that we can achieve a higher throughput than with a completely open system like Bitcoin. And this is something that is important to consider if you're looking at different use cases, because usually you want your whatever you're running to be performant. So using a blockchain can be a huge drawback in terms of performance. Another thing which is usually easier if we go more towards the centralized solutions is also privacy. As I mentioned before, we can achieve privacy on the blockchain, but this requires additional measures. If we have a centralized system and we don't care whether the centralized entity has access to the data because we completely trust it, then we don't need to have any complicated protocols running to provide us with privacy. However, if we have a completely open system, we need to use expensive cryptography and so on. So this is, for example, in Zcash, where we have a very high grade of anonymity. If we use the anonymous transactions, we pay a penalty in terms of the computation that we have to put into creating zero-knowledge proofs that will allow us to create transactions without losing privacy. If we have a completely centralized system with some trusted entity, let's say bank payments, we fully trust the bank. Any third party will not be able to see the bank transaction that we are executing. So let's go into our methodology. So we provided this flowchart in our paper, and the first question that we have on there is, do you need to store state? And this is kind of a simple question, I think, because if we don't need to store any state, then we don't even need database, so why would we need a blockchain? So if we don't need to store any state, don't use a blockchain. If we have multiple writers in the system, so writer in this case means a participant in the consensus protocol. So if we have a permission system, these will be the participants in the permission consensus. If we have an open system, this can basically be anyone, because anyone can become a miner in permissionless blockchains and actually create blocks. So there we have the question, do we have multiple writers that have to write to the system? Is there like one entity that just writes everything, or are there multiple entities that should participate in this? If there's a single writer, then we also don't need a blockchain because we can just get the data from that single writer. If we do have multiple writers, then we can still have the option that we might have some trusted third party that can always be online. So this would then again be a very simple centralized system where every writer just sends data to the online trusted third party. That party writes it to the database. Everyone else can get the data from that trusted third party. If we have that option, and so in this case, I should mention this as well, if we have the question, can you use an online trusted third party, this can also be understood as, do you want to have a trusted third party? Because maybe we have we don't want to have these trust assumptions that we have this single party. So maybe we want to have, we don't want to have this trusted third party. That would then mean that we cannot use it, right? So if we can use an online trusted third party, we're again better off if we don't use a blockchain because, as mentioned before, a centralized system tends to be much more efficient. If we don't have an online trusted third party, we can ask ourselves the questions, are all writers known? So this means that if we have a system where we have multiple companies that want to run protocols between them, then they usually will know with which other companies they're doing business with, so they know all of the parties. On the other hand, in a system like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on, we have a completely decentralized cryptocurrency where we don't know all of the writers, and we want this property that anyone can participate. So if we don't know all of the writers, then the one possibility that we have is use a permissionless blockchain, because for permissioned blockchains we do need to know the writers. So if we do know the writers, we can again go and ask this question of trust. Do we trust all of the writers? If we trust all of the writers, then there's no reason in running a Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus protocol because we know that none of them will cheat, so we don't need to use a blockchain. If we don't trust all of the writers, then we have kind of this last question, whether we want public verifiability. So public verifiability means that anyone can look at the data and verify verify the state of the system. If we want this property, then we can use a public permissionless permissioned blockchain, which basically means that we have a permissioned blockchain that also publishes the data or the state of the ledger to the public. Otherwise, we can use a private permissioned blockchain, which would mean that the read access is also limited to the limited set of participants. And I mean, this last decision is often a question of what you want. So in a private permissioned blockchain, it's again easier to have privacy for transactions, for smart contract execution and so on, but we might want to have this property that anyone can verify. Okay, so with this, let's look at some use cases. So the first use case, this is something that is kind of often proposed as a good use case for blockchain, is supply chain management. And the example I'm using here is that we have some refrigerated truck and we want to track the temperature of that truck because that truck is delivering some goods to some client. And the client wants to later verify that the cool chain was kept the whole time, and otherwise there shouldn't be any payment. Okay, so how can we do this? Well, we can put some sensor into this truck, and the sensor writes data to the blockchain. Now here, of course, we have a problem that if we just tamper with the sensor and the sensor sends wrong data to the blockchain, then we cannot rely on the data that we get there, right? So this means that we need some trusted sensor. We need some tamper-proof hardware where we can make sure that the data that sensor records actually ends up in the blockchain. However, even that is not really enough because there are other possibilities how we can cheat the system. So for example, there might be many other attacks, but for example, if we just have this sensor in this refrigerated truck, then we could simply put the sensor in some small box that we cool down. We don't have to cool down the full truck. We can save some money because cooling down a truck costs money. So we just put the sensor in a small compartment that we cool down, or we just freeze the sensor or do something like that. And the sensor is tamper-proof, so it will put the data that it recorded onto the blockchain. But the data is still not the correct data because the goods are stored in the uncooled part of the truck. So this means that we also need to trust the environment of that sensor. We need to somehow trust whoever operates the supply chain truck. And this completely changes the trust assumptions that we actually want. So what we want is to have a trustless system. We don't have to trust the supplier. We can check the correctness of the data and then basically execute payments based on that. But that's not what we have here. So now if we go through our methodology here, we start at the first box. Do you need to store state? Yes, of course, we want to store the temperature data. Then, are there multiple writers? Yes, probably, because we probably don't just have one refrigerated truck. We have a whole system. We have a supply chain, so there will be multiple writers. Can we use an online trusted third party? In this case, we actually want to remove trust, so we want to just get the data from the sensors. So maybe we could use some online trusted third party, but that again changes what we actually intend to do. So in this case, we cannot use an online trusted third party. Do we know all the writers? Yes, we have the sensors. We know which sensors are part of the system. We might know which sensors belong to which truck. So we get to this decision box here. And now this is the important question, right? So at this point, we want to know, are all of the writers trusted? And what we want is not to trust them. But using what we've seen before, we actually need to trust them. There might be at some point some technical solution around that, but currently it seems like there's no way around trusting the sensor and its environment. Even if we couldn't cheat the environment, we would still need to trust the sensor. So in this case, we actually need to trust all of these sensors, which means that we end up down here, don't use blockchain. And this also ties in with what I mentioned in the beginning with the authenticity. So the blockchain does not provide authenticity. We can get authenticity of the sensor data by having a tamper-proof sensor signing temperature readings. But once we have that, we can simply send the signed temperature readings to the client, because there's no possibility to fake those if they are signed. I mean, we can still cheat the sensor by putting it in a fridge, but just from the principle of having this data, there's no real benefit of putting it on the blockchain. There's no equivalent to double spending problem that we have here. So we can simply take the data that the sensor records, send it to the client, and the client can execute the payment based on the sensor data. So basically, what we have a trusted sensor and environment, and whatever we read with the sensor, we simply send directly to the client. And this way, we don't need the blockchain. We get the same outcome. The client gets sensor data with the same amount of accuracy that the sensor data would have by using a blockchain. But we don't have all of the inefficiencies that we would get by using a blockchain. Of course, this does not mean that we cannot use the blockchain to pay for the sensor data or pay for whatever we get delivered with this, but we don't gain anything from putting the sensor data onto the chain. And this is kind of the general problem of how we can get reliable data into the blockchain. So we have we have our physical world, We have the blockchain that lives in the digital world, and we somehow need to bridge this gap. And it's not that this is impossible, but it's not very easy to do. So what we can do is use oracles that basically record some data about the world and put it into the blockchain. But this means that we add a trusted party as the oracle. And in the case with the sensor data, this party would actually be one of the parties of the contract, which means that we need that we have a fully trusted party, which is also a party in the transaction. So if we use something like this, this can work well for many things if the oracle is some third party that reliably provides trusted data. And we can also, so there are different solutions how we can take data from a website, put that onto the blockchain, but we still need to trust the data provider. One very common example for the use of oracles is flight insurance, where you want to have a smart contract that insures you for cancellation of a flight. If we use an oracle for the flight data, we can probably do this quite easily, because if we have some airline which is not a party of the insurance contract, we can be pretty sure that we can trust the data that the airline publishes about their flights. So if we have an oracle that can take the data from that website, put it onto the blockchain, then we have kind of bridged this gap. We use the trusted party, but that party is not part of the contract, so it's a lesser trust assumption than if we have a party that's actually part of the contract that we're looking at. Yes, so the takeaway from this example is that we need some interface between the physical and digital world. I think this was also mentioned in a talk this morning. This interface can change our trust model. So with the sensor, we have seen that this interface that we have there kind of forces us to trust one of the parties of the contract. And this change of trust model can eliminate some of the benefits that the blockchain gives us. Now, let's look at a different example, one that is more closely related to cryptocurrencies as well, which is interbank payments. So first, I'll give you a quick overview a simplified overview of how this currently works, roughly. So here we have Alice and we have Bob, and Alice wants to send $100 to Bob. And Alice has her account in Swiss francs at the bank A in Switzerland. Bob has his account in US dollars at the bank B in the US. And we somehow want to execute the payment. And it's not as easy as just having bank A tell bank B, hey, Alice wants to send Bob $100. Instead, we have the system which is called correspondent banking system, where we sometimes need to go over multiple hops. So in this case, how it would work is that first, Alice's account gets debited with, in this case, 99 francs and 46 Rappen, because this is the equivalent of $100. On the other side, the bank A would credit this in their own Swiss franc position, debit their dollar position. So this is basically the exchange. At this point, we exchange Swiss francs for US dollars. Now those US dollars, in this case, assuming that bank B is not the correspondent bank of bank A, so banks usually have these correspondent banks in different countries with whom they collaborate, and this will basically mean that bank A has an account with their correspondent bank. And now if bank B is not a correspondent bank of bank A first has to send the money to their correspondent bank in the US, which would be bank C in this case. So for this, Bank A basically keeps a so-called mirror account for Bank C, which is like a virtual account that Bank C has at Bank A. And this account gets credited with $100. And this means that the total balance of all the positions kind of balances out. So everything that we have on the debit side, we also have on the credit side. Bank C will debit the account that Bank A has at their bank. And since Bank C and Bank B are both in the US, they can go through the US central bank, the Fed, to basically settle their payments. So they don't need to have accounts with each other. They can both have accounts at the central bank and use them to settle it. So in this case, they would send the money, or they would credit the money on the mirror account of the central bank. The central bank debits the amount on the account that Bank C has with the central bank and credits it to the account that Bank B has with the central bank. Then Bank B debits this on the mirror account that the central bank has in their books and will finally credit it to Bob. So you see we have a lot of hops there that we have to do, a lot of exchanges. And this is kind of complicated because this can also, if we have, for example, some bank in South America and we want to send money from Switzerland there, then we probably have to go through the US, and then that means that we can have an additional 2 hops in there. So this means that we have kind of a long chain of these hops, and we always need these trust assumptions between the banks. So in this case, Bank A has to trust Bank C has to trust Bank A. Bank B and Bank C both have to trust the US central bank, but I think that's kind of a given. So we have these different trust relationships there that are all necessary to do this. And if one of the links kind of breaks, because maybe we have another hop with different correspondent bank and they don't want to extend credit anymore, then we might not be able to execute the payment and we have to roll back everything. Okay, so overall this is quite complicated. Now, an idea there would be to replace this with a blockchain. So let's go through our system again. Again, we need to store state. We have multiple writers. We have different banks that participate in the system. Can we use an online trusted third party? This probably works if we're just looking at a single country, because we could use the central bank, but then probably the central bank doesn't want to act as a trusted third party that's online all the time. It's sort of the current system right now. So for settlements, the central bank will be used. But for the sake of this, because we have international payments, we'll say no. Are all writers known? Yes, they're all established banks. Are all writers trusted? Probably not, because we don't want to trust every bank that's on some link of the correspondent banks. And then, is public verifiability required? This depends on opinion, I guess. Maybe we want to have, maybe we want to allow people to verify what their banks are doing, maybe not. So this can go either way. So in this case, it might make sense to use a blockchain. How could such a system look in practice? So probably we wouldn't just have one blockchain, but we could have a system where we have different ledgers. So here L1, L2, L3, which are each kind of for their own country. And they're connected by some banks that might have banking licenses in 2 different countries. And now if we want to execute the payment from Bank A to Bank D, we can go through the intermediate links, and we can use cross-chain atomic swaps to make sure that the whole payment is atomic, and we don't need to trust everyone on that path. Okay, so basically to summarize, do you need a blockchain? Maybe. it's always good to evaluate the actual use case. So this is kind of probably the most important message of my talk, I think. Choose the technology based on your use case and not the other way around. So don't start with a technology and then try to use it for everything, but look at what you actually want to do. And then if blockchain can help you do it, use it. Otherwise, do it without a blockchain. And check your trust model. So make sure that what you're actually doing keeps to the trust model that you have in mind, because if you have things like trusted sensors and so on, this might completely change your trust model, in which case it might be easier to use a different solution. All right, thanks for listening. I'm now open for questions if there's enough time. Yeah.
For this second example,
yeah.
it would have been easier to send $100 to the White House for the Mexican war. No blockchain.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you want to do, but presumably Alice and Bob want to keep their money and not fund some border wall.
One last question.
Yeah, so turn to the page of the flowchart.
The clicker doesn't work anymore. Ah, yeah.
So basically, we use the flowchart, most reference to the old writers and trusted. That's fine.
Yes.
I will argue that for most of the cases, they are all trusted to a certain extent. Right? So basically, I think that maybe it's not like when they are trusted, you will not use blockchain, but you need to design the blockchain in such a way that you can verify their trust. So it is not a completely no, yes, it's always somewhere in between.
I don't think so. I mean, I agree. Often you have some different levels of trust. So you might trust them for some things, but not for others. But I also think that there are quite a lot of examples where you absolutely don't trust the other writers.
Like for the truck driver thing, maybe, for example, you want a signature from 3 of the fellow truck driver in the chat, the sensor you designed, you want blockchain system in such a way. So
Yes. So this is something. I mean, this is kind of a simple methodology, but I mean, this is anyway the case. If you use any kind of blockchain, you trust that there is an honest majority, usually. I mean, you have assumptions for proof-of-work blockchains that you have an honest majority of the mining power. For BFT consensus, you have to trust a large majority of the validators and so on. So there are always these kind of collective trust assumptions, but you don't trust the single writers.